In 1731, a Spanish commander sliced off a British captain's ear and told him, "Take this to your king." That severed ear would spark a war that lasted 9 years, involved thousands of deaths, and changed the course of empires. This is the story of the most absurdly named and brutally real conflict in history. But was the ear even real? And what really started this war? Let's rewind to 1731. The Caribbean is a hornet's nest of imperial rivalry. Captain Robert Jenkins, a British mariner, is sailing his ship, the Rebecca, when he's boarded by the Spanish Coast Guard, the Guarda Costa. They accuse him of smuggling, a common charge since British merchants were constantly trying to break Spain's trade monopoly. The Spanish commander, Julio León Fandino, isn't in the mood for debate. He draws his sword, and in a single, brutal motion, slices off Jenkins' ear. He then hands it to him with the infamous command to show it to King George II. Jenkins, remarkably stoic, just wraps the ear in a cloth, sails back to England, and then he and his ear vanish from the pages of history for 7 years. What was really going on? Well, the Spanish Empire was struggling to control its vast American territories, and the Caribbean was crawling with British smugglers, looking to make a quick profit. For the British merchants, Spain's trade monopolies were strangling their business. Tensions were at a boiling point. Dozens of British ships had been seized, and their sailors sometimes tortured. The Spanish, for their part, were also dealing with rampant British piracy. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Fast forward 7 years to 1738. Robert Jenkins is mysteriously summoned to appear before the British Parliament. Why now? Because a powerful political faction in Britain, the Warhawks, desperately needed a propaganda win. They wanted a war with Spain to protect their commercial interests. But the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, was a man of peace. Jenkins was their perfect tool. Legend has it that Jenkins stood before the outraged members of Parliament, reached into his pocket, and produced a shriveled, pickled ear. He held it up and declared, "This is what they did to me." The room erupted. The story was electric. Historians still debate whether it was even his ear, or if he brought one at all, but it didn't matter. The press went wild. Political cartoons and furious pamphlets flooded the streets of London. The ear became a national symbol of Spanish aggression. Public pressure on the government to act became unstoppable. The Prime Minister, Walpole, had been fighting to maintain peace for years, but the story of the ear was the final straw. It was just too powerful, too visceral. This wasn't really about one man's ear. It was about money, empire, and national pride. The ear was just the perfect excuse. In October 1739, owing to the immense public and political pressure, Great Britain officially declared war on Spain, and history would give this conflict its unforgettable name, the War of Jenkins Ear. With war declared, British confidence was sky high. They thought it would be a quick, easy victory. Admiral Edward Vernon was sent to the Caribbean, and in late 1739, he scored a stunning victory by capturing the Spanish stronghold of Portobello in Panama. Back home, Vernon was hailed as a national hero. Medals were struck celebrating his victory, and the public's jingoistic fever reached a new high, but they were celebrating too soon. The true test came in 1741 at the city of Cartagena de Indias, in modern-day Colombia. The British assembled the largest naval expedition in their history. Up to that point, a force bigger than the Spanish Armada, with 186 ships and over 23,000 men. Their goal was to crush Spanish power in the Americas once and for all. But defending Cartagena was one of history's most formidable military figures. The Spanish Admiral Bladelezo. He was a man who had already lost an eye, an arm, and a leg in previous battles, and he was not about to give up. The British laid siege to the city for weeks, but it was a complete disaster. Bladelezo, with only about 3,000 defenders, outmaneuvered the British at every turn. He used brilliant tactics, like stretching a great chain across the harbor entrance to block their ships. Meanwhile, tropical diseases like yellow fever and dysentery tore through the British ranks far more effectively than any Spanish cannon. Amphibious assaults failed repeatedly. In the end, it was a catastrophic defeat for the British. Over 18,000 of their men were killed or died of disease. A humiliated Admiral Vernon was forced to retreat. It was one of the greatest military victories in Spanish history, yet it's been largely forgotten by the English-speaking world. And here's a surprising connection for you. A young man named Lawrence Washington, the half-brother of the future American President George Washington, served under Admiral Vernon during this disastrous campaign. When Lawrence returned to Virginia, he named his family estate in honor of his former commander, Mount Vernon. George Washington would later inherit it, meaning that in a strange twist of fate, Robert Jenkins' severed ear is indirectly responsible for the name of America's most famous historic home. Soon after the Cartagena debacle, the War of Jenkins Ear got absorbed into a much larger European conflict, the War of Austrian Succession. The fighting spread across the globe, from Europe to India to the Americas. The original dispute between Britain and Spain became a mere sideshow. The year that supposedly started it all was completely forgotten. So how did it all end? After 9 long years of fighting and tens of thousands of deaths, the war concluded with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. The result, basically, a stalemate. Almost no territory changed hands, and the original trade issues were left unresolved. Both empires were simply exhausted. The war started over an ear, had achieved absolutely nothing. So let's circle back to the central question. Was the ear even real? The evidence suggests that, yes, Jenkins was likely attacked and did lose his ear, but the timing of his testimony is deeply suspicious. Why wait 7 years? He was almost certainly paid, or at least heavily encouraged by the war party in Parliament, to tell his story at that precise moment. He and his ear were used. This war teaches us a powerful lesson. Wars rarely start for the reasons we're told. They are usually about money, resources, and power, wrapped in a more emotionally appealing story. The War of Jenkins Ear has a bizarre legacy. It stands as a cautionary tale about the power of propaganda and how governments can manufacture consent for war. This pattern repeats throughout history. Think of Remember the Maine, which sparked the Spanish-American War, or the Gulf of Tonkin incident in the Vietnam War. The formula is always the same. Find an emotional incident, amplify public outrage, and then use that outrage to justify a pre-existing agenda. Jenkins himself faded back into obscurity and died a few years later. His famous ear was probably lost, or had rotted away long before the war even began. In the end, a severed ear didn't start a war. Imperial greed, economic rivalry, and political maneuvering did. Jenkins was just a pawn in a much larger game. His story is a powerful reminder that we should always question the narratives we're given, especially when they're pulling at our heartstrings. Because every war has its Jenkins Ear, that emotional trigger designed to obscure the real motives. What other historical events do you think were manufactured for war? Drop your theories in the comments. And if you found this story as wild as I did, smash that like button and subscribe for more history that didn't make it into your textbooks. Thanks for watching.